There yesterday on Mackie and Judd with Rami, and I noticed what Tom did not say is, stop it, guys. There's no way they would trade Stefon Diggs. And that leads us directly into our topic of the day. Matthew Coller, ESPN's Courtney Cronin here. The most aggressive or even radical move the Minnesota Vikings could make this offseason. And of course, Courtney, I want to get your thoughts on the Super Bowl and how it relates to the Vikings, but we do not waste any time in the NFL. We just go into full offseason mode. There are mock drafts. There are free agent lists. I mean, it's go time.
I'm ready for my bump to come in so we can start doing mock drafts. Like, I'm prepared to do one today.
Really? Oh, Courtney, our draft scout is here.
She's here.
All right.
She's got a white hat on. That means I'm here.
Okay. All right. I'm excited.
So, but to get back to, you're right, like the offseason, I know that there's now 3 weeks. This is supposed to be kind of the dead period between now and the combine, but it never truly is. This is when we start finding out a little bit more. I mean, you see yesterday, the Falcons say that they're not going to try to keep Vic Beasley around. He's going to hit free agency. Like, you're going to start seeing more and more things like that. Not necessarily teams going out on a limb the way that the Falcons did, but those numbers are going to start coming out about what the Kirk Cousins extension could potentially look like. Dalvin Cook as well. But I guess to get back to your original point, were you asking me, or were you saying that maybe we'd get to it later?
No, we're getting to Courtney, our draft scout, later. Okay. Some of how the Super Bowl relates to the Vikings, or what it tells you about the Vikings.
All right.
But the first, right off the bat here, because I've just been thinking about this a lot. So last segment with Rami on Score North Live, we discussed these scenarios of trading up for Tua Tagovailoa. And I asked Rami, would you trade Danielle Hunter and the 25th pick to move up to number 2 to take Tua? And that was the most radical move I could think of. Like, of all the things that the Vikings could potentially do with the assets they have, with the landscape of the draft and free agency and everything like that, would you do the most aggressive thing that you could possibly do, which would be, I think, to trade a superstar edge rusher in his prime to move up? And this would be kind of like Oakland trading away Khalil Mack.
Sure.
And I look at the Bears and you say, well, Khalil Mack is great and their defense is great, but their quarterback is bad, so nothing matters. And you're going to be paying Khalil Mack $1 gazillion to be on a good defense that doesn't matter because you have Mitch Trubisky, and won't matter until someone is better. So if you're the Vikings, you might say, and this is just to try to defend the most radical move I could justify, it would be, well, look, you have developed pass rushers, including Danielle Hunter. Can't you do that again? Can't you draft other people, or have, someone like a Fadi Adenabo or Stephen Weatherly, or guys that you've been working with become a rotation at the edge and have somewhere in the ballpark of this production, which isn't worth anywhere near as much as a quarterback will be to your franchise?
Yeah, and I mean, the fact of the matter is that next contract, that restructure that is eventually coming for Danielle, because he's way outplayed the current team-friendly deal that he took 2 off seasons ago at the age of 23. If it is a team like Washington, and I didn't know their draft needs until you mentioned that, and they're obviously the number 2 pick. That's why you suggested trading Danielle Hunter and the 25th pick to move up to 2, because Burrow would go number 1 and then Tua would potentially go number 2. They need an offensive tackle, a wide receiver, interior offensive line, cornerback, linebacker, tight end, edge rusher. That's like the way, way bottom. But I think for a haul of that size, where you could get a wide receiver at 25, where the hell did they get Terry McLaurin? Lot less further down than 25.
Debo Samuel's
same thing. Yep. And, you can get a corner at 25. You could probably, even though I'm not keen on spending a 25th overall pick on an offensive lineman, they have 2 needs there. You could potentially get somebody at 25. Like, it's worth it if you're the other team. It's worth it. I'm kind of still on the yes and no thing with Danielle. Just given I don't know if you can really develop a guy that well. Like, I mean, I think that there's something so special about him. He's a once-in-a-generation type defensive lineman that I'm just not so sure. Because look at...
That's an interesting statement.
I'm a believer in that. I know not a lot of people are, but I'm
not. I don't think I am.
That's fine. But take a look at the haul that they've had the last few years. Jalen Holmes, Jaleel Johnson. Help me here. Who else am I forgetting that they drafted? 5th, 4th, 6th round pick. Those guys haven't panned out to that level. And that's what I'm saying. Like, Stephen Weatherly has kind of reached his ceiling to where he's at. We thought it was going to potentially be higher, and maybe it will be, because he even admitted he needed to kind of fix some things this offseason. I mean, Fadi Adenabo leveled up, that's for sure, in his 3rd year with the Vikings. But Can he ever be Danielle Hunter? I don't know. But you go to a rotation if you're at that spot. But is that rotation going to be as effective when you still have the same sort of issues on the interior? Like, I'm just trying to put all the pieces together and be rational about this. But I do have one that I can be irrational and go head flying into the wall, just like you did.
We got plenty of time for that.
Okay.
What is it?
Well,
were you going to bring one up?
I would trade Diggs. And I know that's kind of like not new news. It's not a new idea. We've been tabling it since week 4, but I would trade Diggs, and I think you can make an argument to trade Dalvin Cook too.
Okay, let's get back to those in just a second, because I want to defend the idea of trading Danielle Hunter to move up to get Tua.
Okay.
That someone like Zadarius Smith is a good example of a guy who was with Baltimore, and they said, we can't really re-sign you. And he goes to Green Bay, and he's an impact player, and he's really good on a team that won a lot of games. In fact, you could argue he was the best at what he does, that 3-4 move around type of guy. He led the NFL in pressures. But the Ravens defense didn't really fall off that much. They traded for Marcus Peters instead, and he ends up getting a bunch of interceptions. They get Earl Thomas instead, and they basically filled in that talent on the back end and were just as good. And I look at someone like Shaquille Barrett, who was the league leader in sacks, and his team missed the playoffs because their quarterback played bad. And Khalil Mack missed the playoffs because the quarterback didn't play very good. I mean, the impact of these players can be great. And Nick Bosa dominated the Super Bowl. But what happened? The better quarterback ended up winning the game, because that's what happens. And there are a lot of guys who are very good at rushing the passer. I don't think it's impossible to find one. I think it's impossible to find Darrelle Revis, like a corner who you could stick on an island and shuts down anyone. I think it's impossible or really tough to find Pat Mahomes, or a great quarterback. And when you do, the value is so crazy high. With an edge rusher, they're 2 edge rushers who are great, were a 3rd and a 4th round pick who they put in great positions and developed. And that's not to say Hunter is bad or anything. He's an unbelievable talent. It's just anything compared to a quarterback, I would trade.
Well, I get the value reason for that. And we're so fresh off the Super Bowl for seeing this is the model. Like, the Vikings thought they had the model. The 49ers thought they had the model. It was the run-first mentality and having a quarterback come through when you needed him to. But if you don't have that ultimate playmaker, the guy who you can trust in the situations that Patrick Mahomes was put in the second half to lead his team on a 21-point rally, like, I think it's so few and far between that you can find quarterbacks that can do that. And I mean, yeah, if Tua is that guy, this is a good option. It's a good scenario to at least play around with. I try to think rationally here, because I know who the hell the head coach is, and he's not going to let Danielle Hunter walk out of that building.
Of course not.
And so that's where my stress level is trying to figure this out. I can't equate it.
Let's put it this way. It's radical moves you can defend, not radical moves they're going to do.
Fine. But the Diggs one is one they could feasibly do.
Yes. So let's talk about both of those, because those go under categories of being radical for sure. Now let's start with Diggs. There's just too much smoke not to be some fire with the idea of trading Stefon Diggs. And when you listen to Tom Pelissero that we opened the show with from NFL Network, he did not pour cold water on that idea. He didn't say, just like none of us have either that are around the team, we've never said, oh, he's gone for sure, because we don't know how that's going to play out. We know the team doesn't want to move him. But I've gotten the sense over the last 2 years that Diggs wants to be on a team that's going to throw the ball more and feature him as the number 1 guy. And he certainly proved that he could be that when Adam Thielen was out, that he can be the dominant number 1 receiver on a team that wins a lot of games. That would be his reasoning for wanting to go elsewhere. The Vikings would be to get something really good in return, which might include moving up in the draft and also clearing a little bit of cap space. $5.5 million goes a long way when you've got 0.
Yeah. Well, if you trade him, I mean, he's got a $14.5 million hit right now in 2020.
Now, do you make all of that if you trade him, though? Like, do you get all of that? Because that's where it gets wonky. It would
depend. His base salary of 10.9 is guaranteed on the 3rd day of the league year. So who's responsible for the entire part of the base salary? Do you trade him before then? Like, I mean, right, that's why it gets...
Let's just call it cap space then, because it gets really wonky for how much cap space. So the positives are you get cap space and you can get something good back. Mm-hmm. The negatives are, oh my gosh, you just traded one of the best receivers in the league, and receivers are super valuable. So is that something that you would defend them doing if they did?
I would defend it because I don't think the identity of this team is changing. Gary Kubiak is running this offense, and it is still going to run through Dalvin Cook. I don't anticipate all of a sudden it's just going to shift and Kirk's going to get into a drop back game, 13 out of 16 games next year. I just don't see that, where Diggs is in the prime of his career right now. He wants to go to a place where he can be the number one, the clear-cut number one. That's just not going to happen on this team when you have Adam Thielen, who very desperately needs a bounce back year next year because it's when his new contract kicks in. He has a $12.8 million hit. Like, he has to play up to that after an injury-ridden season this year. And Diggs is kind of looking at that, presumably thinking, look at the way I've played throughout the entirety of my time here and look at kind of where I'm at among the league's best receivers. I feel like I'm A, underpaid, and B, can go somewhere and outplay this contract so I can get my third. Like, I can't fault him for that. And I also think that if the Vikings look at this where they think of other needs that they have to get in free agency ahead of the draft, like also, if we talk about clearing up cap space, it's probably the most feasible one to do. And I'm with you with the whole where there's smoke, there's fire notion. We never really put the fire out from week 4. I think that it is kind of like smothered it a little bit.
And what's funny about that is that you and I were even talking about it in training camp, and then it quickly came to fruition in the first quarter of the season that something was not right there with Diggs. And considering how much money he makes, if you're not going to feature him, if that's not your plan to make him a centerpiece, if not the centerpiece of the offense, the same way a lot of other teams do with their star receivers, like a DeAndre Hopkins, where you're just throwing the ball to this guy all the time. And that's the main part of your offense. I mean, if you look at the number of targets, Michael Thomas is an outlier because they just throw him every play. But even Julio Jones gets 149 targets. Keenan Allen even 147. DeAndre Hopkins 146. And then you have to scroll all the way down to 34th in the NFL with Stefon Diggs, who's in the same category as Robbie Anderson for his number of targets. He really wasn't even far ahead of Sammy Watkins, who was the, third receiver or third or fourth receiving option on the Kansas City Chiefs. If you're Diggs and you think that you belong in that top echelon of NFL receivers, which I would not blame him for feeling that way, considering his production per throw in his direction, then you might be saying, guys, I think you just need to do something else with me. I am never for taking a receiver of his talent out of the mix. I mean, I don't think a receiver is a position where you can just get away with getting rid of someone this good. But it sort of speaks to the situation with Diggs, where we think they're at. Like, did they think that 2020 is a Super Bowl run for this team, do you think?
Yeah, because, I mean, what else can they do?
Well, you could take a step back to take a step forward would be the one thing.
In what way?
In the way that if you look at the Vikings salary cap, they could make $39 million by removing Everson Griffin, Riley Reif, Linval Joseph, and Xavier Rhodes. And then
so you're just, but like, we talk
even
about
more with Stefon Diggs.
I know, but like, we're talking about the quarterback position here. That's kind of like what it all boils down to. You're going to waste $31 million and just say, okay, 8-8, we accept it. Like, I have a hard time believing that anybody in ownership would be okay with that. And that's why the pressure's on this front office to figure it out. Like, and you do bring up, there are a lot of cuts that could potentially happen. But the look of this team might not look the same in a month from now.
But if you're trying to win in 2020, then removing Stefon Diggs from the equation is not a way to get there.
Unless you draft a receiver early.
But even then, we've seen that, and that doesn't always